Rorri, thank you so much for joining the We Rise podcast. I'm so glad to have you on today. It's fun to hear about different people's stories and your podcast, and really looking forward to sharing what you're up to with other folks. Can you introduce yourself so folks know who I have the delight in speaking to today?
Yes, of course. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Rorri Geller-Mohamed. I am the founder of an organization called You Power Change, where I do anti-racism and diversity, equity, inclusion coaching and consulting. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker, so I'm a therapist by trade,
Yeah,
and have experience doing that.
awesome. So, what it sounds like grounded and also deeply rooted work, and so I imagine active right now. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like? Do you work with clients one-on-one? Do you work with communities? How do folks find you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I've sort of shifted and transformed and changed different ways, of course, with this work. I've always been very focused right around social justice and racial equity and justice work. And that's been something that's been very prioritized. And so the way folks connect with me, I do both work with people in a group setting through a program called Changemakers, which helps specifically for white women to help them feel more empowered and ready to engage in work for racial equity and justice and what that looks like and finding their place really in that work.
Awesome. Yeah, powerful and timely work. Tell us a little bit more, Rory, about your own story, if you're willing to. How did you
Yeah.
get to doing this work, which is just so needed today, and for so many years, many years, it's been so needed.
Yeah, no, thank you. So it's, I was raised in a multiracial family. So I'm white and I'm also, my ethnic background is Ashkenazi Jewish. And so having a sibling of color was something that really opened my eyes to issues around race and racism that for many white people don't necessarily have in their formative years. That was sort of brought for me very much forward and was a big, very eye-opening, right? Sort of this lens that I was seeing that many other people don't typically have. And so for me, trying to find my place in what this looked like and what this work was, and understanding even like a systems level perspective of it really didn't happen until college. And that's why I've been like choosing to go into social work was very much based around that. And so that was very much like the early part of it. And sort of engaging in that.
Yeah. And how does the connection with social work, will you paint a picture of what social work looks like as different from traditional therapy? Is it the same, or how do you bring that work into your anti-racism allyship building with white women and other folks? What's the connection points there?
So the cool thing about being trained as a social worker is you are trained to focus on both a systems perspective, so like bigger things, institutions, organizations, as well as individual issues, right? Like that a therapist, right, deals with individuals and family, right? We're very much like on multiple levels. So individual context, family context, and then organizational context. And so all of that work, and for many years, I worked as a school social worker for many years, and all of the work doing one-on-one individual work, I was always bringing in these bigger systemic issues because you have to, and like family issues, right? It's all part of individual work. And when that's left out, you're really not working on the root of the issue of why someone might be feeling some of the emotions or struggles that they're going through, and actually being able to work on that. And I know for me, like one of the things that really drew me to it wasn't to really go into therapy initially. I ended up coming around and now kind of looping a little bit out of that, which has been interesting sort of transformation. But when I initially started, it was really around policy practice. That's when I said I chose social work to go into policy practice and say, how do we change these policies that are, there's so many inequities, there's so many injustices. And that was really from my earlier years, like years ago when I was doing that.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that's looked like, if you're up to? I mean, that's
sure.
So many people, see the things that just feel so fundamentally unequal, not even from an initial access standpoint, not even counting privilege and so many things. What led you towards that, and what's led you away from that work?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've always done throughout all my work, working in nonprofit organizations, working in education and school systems, has always been bringing the issue of a lens, right? This anti-racism lens to the conversation. A lot of times it's missing in those spaces, and just being able to speak up in a meeting and say something around like, well, here, how are we looking at this? What role do issues of race and racism play in this conversation and the way that the school is functioning or the way the organization is functioning? And so being able to bring that up, and then also try to get at that time, right, support of organizations to come in. How do we get the education for training for staff that's needed? What policies, practices, procedures need to be looked at, adjusted, discussed? And so I think for many, many years, I was very much in this position of sort of a catalyst for bringing up some of these things, or maybe in spaces that it wasn't being discussed. And that's sort of morphed through my path. And I think some of that has been for different reasons, but I think to helping other white people to also be able to do that too, right? How do they build their own leadership? And a lot of times it's our own emotions that get in the way. So like still like the one-on-one, I mean, I do work with people still one-on-one around these, like building their anti-racism leadership. How do white women build, and white people, right, build their anti-racism leadership? What does that even mean when it's like, well, is that even our place to do? So me like I went through a lot of that, I feel like, in my earlier like 20s and earlier years of navigating, and still continue, of course. I feel like it's a lifelong journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving from the individual one-on-one work to the collective work or working with groups more, can you tell us more about your Changemakers program and how you work with folks and how folks make the decision to do the work as well, which can be hard and also a sensitive place for folks. You know, they often, you know, well-intentioned and often there's such a big learning curve. And one of the things I loved, Rorri, when I was just reading more about your background, as you talked about, you know, that loving support, I think, or loving accountability. Yeah. And that sense of leading with love first also creates doors that open for people, you know, feeling held or feeling a sense of support. It seems, at least from my experience, lets people lean in ways like, okay, you know, okay, I'm here, I'm showing up, I want to learn. How do folks find you and how do you work with groups in the work?
Yeah. So there so much to kind of say around that. I think one is how people find me, how like what the work actually looks like. A lot of it is really around, and when people come to this work, is really around what's going on in somebody's life that's bringing them into it this moment. So a lot of times people are maybe could be multiple things, an issue like within family, right? Where they're, especially right after the murder of George Floyd, there were a lot of conversations where people that identified as white and progressive and liberal we're then trying to do more of this work and speak up and show up, but we're having a lot of conflict within family systems and within their family structure. And so a lot of that is, how do we navigate those relationships? How do we navigate, what skills do we need to be able to have those conversations? How do we build bridges? So a lot of it is skill building, and a lot of it as a therapist, those are skills I can bring right as of doing family work, having experience being as a family therapist, right? As a relationship, doing couples therapy. So all of that stuff, individual. So it's through that way, but people also experience it at work, right? Even many times whether social, whatever profession, right? If you're when you see it and then nothing's being addressed, it feels very frustrating. It feels very isolating. So a lot of the work we do too is, how do we decrease that feeling of isolation? How do we have, many of us, as specifically as white women, right, don't have a lot of other white women in our life that are also doing this work, that are having these conversations, that are navigating similar feelings together. And so this is a space to be able to process and do that work where we're not necessarily causing harm, because otherwise there's a fear of, right, if we're just, how do we express this and process some of these emotions without causing harm?
Yeah, absolutely. So well said. So it sounds like it's creating the space for people to learn, creating community, creating a place where people can learn and explore those edges a little bit together. Can you talk a little bit about what the work looks like? You know, when you're working with white women or people identify as white, you know, what does that process look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, a few different steps, right? I think it's important for people to identify like where they are, right? Where is it impacting them in their life? I think it's important to kind of take a step back from just the immediate of like, it's feeling really hard here. So maybe it's feeling really hard in this one spot at work, or it's feeling really hard in this one spot at home, or a white woman with a child of color, and it's feeling really hard in this dynamic. Something's going on, right? Taking a step back and just looking at all of the spaces, all of our relationships in our life, and what that's kind of looked like, right? Where do we see where do we have access to push or pull or move around or navigate these conversations? Where do we choose to focus our energy? A big piece of this too is being able to sustain this work. And when, right, this work, it can be draining. It can be, right. Can be tiring, and it's on top of our regular everyday things. So what does this look like? How do we sustain that? And I think that's a big piece of it as well. So I think some of it is, it's building those skills around, how do I have these conversations? What do actions look like? A big piece too, that I think is often missing from the conversation that I bring in, is this idea of creativity. A lot of times we aren't taught or aren't talking about being creative and thinking out of the box of what these things can look like, and are just kind of, how could we create new ways of having these conversations or spaces or doing things differently?
Yeah. And so how do you bring that in, Rorri, that creativity, and are people nervous to engage around creativity? Or are they like, yes, thank you so much for bringing that in? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think people feel a little bit of like a sense of kind of relief, and like I'm able to kind of build on my strengths and things like that. So these people don't identify necessarily as creative, and that's okay. I think for many years I didn't identify as creative, but we are often more creative than we think, and innovative than we think. And so I like to just kind of share examples of different people like that we've seen do amazing different things. So like finding inspiration, but also we don't want to compare, right? It's not like those people did amazing things and we're not, how are we doing this? But then like, what would be fun for you to do, right? What would be enjoyable? What would you like to create? When we look at looking at history, right? When we look at history and we see, for example, right, the freedom schools that were created, right? Like in, I think, like 1950s, 60s, around that time. And Black children at that time were able to learn, right, all about culture, all about, right, advocacy, all of these things, these skills. What if we had something like that for white children that were learning all of these techniques, antiracism stuff? How do we learn? How do we have these conversations? So I think it's also looking at other examples to get ideas, but also just imagining in your own spaces, what kind of groups would you like to be part of? What type of thing would you like to do? Whether it's a book club or and still, I don't like to just get stuck in the education piece either, because I think action is a very important part. So I think it's building on both of those things.
Yeah, I love that connection. So how do people learn and then, find that inspiration to take action? Will you tell us a little bit about what that has looked like? I would, bring it to the community level if you want to.
Yes.
Yeah, either building, so a lot of the themes with the podcast are around resilience, but that, as you well know, can take so many forms. That can be social, it can be environmental, it can be community, it can be ecological. What changes have you seen in your community and region, and what's helped it create a sense of belonging? Because a lot of the work likely has to do with belonging and to grow and be strong over time.
Yeah. And I think for me also, that piece of resilience, that this work really helps me with my resilience, this idea of hope and inspiration. So I'm part of many different like local organized different groups, like doing this work locally. So I'm part of a social work group that does this. I'm part of an anti-racism group locally that does this. And so being part of different various groups, as well as local Jewish group, trying to have these conversations. So being part of it in all different areas within the community, and being able to start and see the changes that each of these groups are able to do, expanding the conversation and seeing how people within these groups are practicing it in their personal life, in their professional life. And in those many ways, I think it's really that ripple effect, but also having these communities where I feel like I can belong, right? That there's other people that have similar values to me, similar things like that. I know for me, the other piece of it that's really huge is my husband's a person of color. And so my kids are multiracial, multicultural, multi-faith, and my husband is Muslim. And as I mentioned, I'm Jewish. And so that's something, so this piece of both belonging and finding spaces to belong is important, as well as pushing institutions to change, to make space for belonging, is something I feel like is both important and needs to be done in tandem.
That's so beautifully said. Creating a sense of belonging and also kind of activating space so belonging can be created, and coming at it from both ways, and experiencing a sense of belonging, and then saying, well, where are people not experiencing belonging? How can that shift and change? What has held communities that you've worked with back, either in the groups professionally or personally that you belong to, or places that you've worked with? I mean, there's so many things that can hold back, and also things that can really catalyze change too.
Yeah. Right. And I think there's like, I could think of many different things, right, that could come up with kind of holding back. I think sometimes, what are we exactly working for? And sometimes like the vision is maybe, I think values can be aligned. And so like the vision might be unclear, and sometimes structure, I think, can get in the way. When I think of some of the groups, some of the, just sort of the internal navigating of that. And I think often that's because when we maybe haven't always been having these conversations, and they're newer to have, and newer ways of thinking, and we're all at maybe different, have different experiences navigating this. So, it takes some time for like that group cohesion piece as well, and these connections. So I think that's one thing. I mean, I think another thing, of course, sometimes, funding or things like that can get in the way of education and training. And I think a big piece of that is people don't necessarily connect that to the overall well-being for everyone, right? Like all of these things are connected to just everyone's overall well-being, and people don't always recognize that this impacts them or this affects them. I know one thing that I often speak about too is, I think often white people consider, when anti-racism work, that we're doing it for other people, right? We're doing this work for people of color, and don't recognize how it also impacts us, ourselves, and for our own liberation, but for this as well. When we see in many, when we look at like school shootings, for example, right? We often see young white males being the perpetrators, and it's never looked at through a racial lens. How come is this? What's happening? What's the root issue? What's going on? And are there aspects, right, around racism or that are not white supremacy, well, it's really white supremacy culture, right, that's kind of impacting that.
Absolutely. So looking at not just what's the news piece, but what's the why. And
yes,
it's such a big question, Rorri, but where do you feel like that entry point is for kids, or for, I have an 11 and 14-year-old, and I think about, they're like not as open to hearing ideas from mom and dad now as they used to be when they were younger. But finding those entry points are so key. So I think more at the adult level, maybe there's more apathy and fatigue, but looking at the root causes, really often I feel like, just in my past years as an educator, it's really more kid to kid where change happens. It's kids talking to other kids sometimes, or in partnership and belonging with adults. I don't know. Where's the entry point there, or entry points?
Yeah, no, and I think there's a few, and I think like that's like the exciting opportunity about it, right? Like when we look at the root issue and we look at what's going on, we're able to kind of identify different ways of different entry points. And so I think, for just throwing it out there, like one of the things is, it's likely, right, that there are often inequities that happen. And so had it been a child of color that had brought this weapon to school, it may not have, right? Would they have been flagged ahead of time? Right? Maybe not, right? But I think there's inequities that why are there metal detectors, right, in many inner city schools where Black and brown children are attending. And yet here we see these school shootings in often white suburban schools. And so there's different, and I'm not saying that metal detectors are the answer, because I don't believe that's the answer either. But I think looking at the actual root issue of youth violence that we're addressing, and the commonalities across that, right? Of where is this anger coming from? Where is this misplacement, right? Why do I not feel a sense, right? That goes back to the sense of belonging too, that you were talking about. So I think, right, how do we create a sense of belonging? I think white identity, like there's different racial identity development, and a lot of times we don't talk about that. It's not often something that is even explored, even right in teaching programs, right? Often that you developmentally things are taught, but we don't talk about racial identity, and everybody, not just white people, right? There's racial identity development, what that can look like for people's identity. So I think a big piece of it is this, right, that sense of belonging. How do we address issues around identity, and making sure that those things are being talked about in not just, right, school settings, if people are connected to faith-based locations, like things like that, after school programs, like all of those places. And also being able to express emotion, right? How are we talking about our emotions? How are we looking at addressing trauma, right? Really in trauma-informed practices. These are really right responses to trauma a lot of times, right? Most of the time when you're going to see someone with a school shooting, or like the perpetrator, if you're going to look back in their history, there's going to be flags there. It's not typically out of nowhere that these behaviors, someone doesn't just wake up one day and go shoot up a school, right? There's flags and things ahead of time. So how are we, and it's also not looking at it from an individual perspective. It's that community piece, that holistically as a community, how are we addressing what this is? And when we have a community that is very homogeneous as well, what aspects do we need to take into consideration about that? And are we recognizing too, why is it like this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the sense of belonging, going back to that as being so core, being willing to ask, having also, I mean, you mentioned funding a little while ago, but having the capacity to be able to hold people's stories, to see what those
Yes.
flags are, to see where there are points of concern, and then
Yes.
to bring in another thread, which is something I see in working with communities a lot around where groups are effective or not, is that trust and relationships, which create that sense of belonging and often take time to develop. Um, so it's key, and it's also challenging to sometimes maintain that. I want to bring a little bit more of your own
Yeah.
story into this, Rorri, about your work today, and you've talked a little bit about how the personal and professional, there's overlap there sometimes. Tell us a
Yes.
little bit about what brings you joy these days
What,
and
yeah.
all that is happening.
Yes. So it's interesting because I feel like identity has always been a big theme throughout my life and around both my life and my work. And so what brings me joy, and I feel like a lot of that is interesting because I feel like being a mother and being, my kids are 4 and 6. And so there's a lot of sort of my identity of what that looks like now and how maybe that was different before.
Yeah, totally.
And so, I mean, I very much enjoy, right, like spending time with family, right? I do very much enjoy that. But of course, right, as a mom, like sometimes, there's, it can be with a 4 and 6-year-olds, it can be a lot sometimes. So I love doing new and exciting things with my kids. I love like learning new things together, going places. Obviously it's COVID, so that's limited. But being able to do that, I love just going for a walk, like being in nature and just being able to walk. I feel like for me is both joyful and peaceful. And I also like being part of groups that are doing work to make an impact in the world. And I feel like that brings me, it brings me joy. It brings me also this sense of I'm being part of making a difference as well.
Yeah, I love that. So connecting with your family, being outside, connecting with nature, and also finding ways to create impact in the world through groups that you're working with. I love that. Joy has been such a big theme, I think, in life, and it's been really fun to hear, to think about joy explicitly, which for me, I think it's related to happiness, but it's different than happiness. It's more of like an effervescent feeling that bubbles up, that I'm grateful for. And is helpful to remember on the days that I struggle. So Rorri, for you, what keeps you moving forward on the days that you struggle? I've heard so many people just talk about what a struggle it's been for them in the last 2 years, and moving into now we're in 2022. What keeps you moving forward on the days you struggle?
Again, I think like seeing other people do this work, I think is inspiring, right? Hearing things happening. I think my kids keep me going, knowing that, this is things I need to be part of creating space for them, right? Creating a better world for them. So like just personally, I think that keeps me going. So those kind of things keep me going. And I think, right, it's hard. Like, I just want to be real, like it's COVID at times, right? It's hard because, when you can't see family and for so many people, right? Everyone's going through this. And I think there's this like overwhelming feeling where we're like up and then we're down and then we're in lockdown and then we're out. And then it's so many different emotions and it's such a roller coaster for sure. And so, and like, even like seeing friends, like that's one too, right? Having, even if it's not on a regular basis, but trying to make the occasional time to like go by myself to meet a friend, right?
So key in different ways. I love that. And just doing it where we can, when we can. You talked a little bit about, engaging with kids. Do you have thoughts, Rorri, about how parents can work with kids around anti-racism work? For people who are moms, those who aren't, choose not to be moms or aren't able to be moms, and might be working with kids in different settings. How can folks engage with kids around anti-racism work?
Yeah, there is a great organization Embrace Race that does great
Mm.
webinars, and I think they have podcasts too or whatever. They have a lot of information available, so I think they are a great resource.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just making it part of your everyday life, but I think the parent has to also do the work first. And so
Yeah.
I think, how does this become part of our regular discussion, but also that it's not the only thing we're talking about, right? So it's,
Mm-hmm.
how do we in general, like when we think of like diversity, equity, inclusion, like how do we bring diversity into our life? What does it look like? Who are our relationships with? Who are we in community with?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big piece of it too, of making sure what are our kids watching us do? So
Mm-hmm.
making sure that we're role modeling the actions and the behaviors that we would hope for them
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
carry out.
And can you tell us a little bit more about what that could look like? If folks are like, gosh,
Yeah.
I want to do this, but where do I start?
Right.
What does that look like at an everyday level? Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about what
Yeah.
that looks
Yeah.
like?
I mean, I think it means like when you look around, do you have friends of color, right? What are your connections? How real are those relationships? Are they just coworkers at work? Are they people that you hang out with outside of work?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know their families? How connected are you? Right. So that's one way of like, who is in your circle? What does your circle look like? What groups are you part of? What groups are your kids part of? Um, who, how diverse racially, culturally, ethnically, right, are in everything way, are the spaces that your kids are in? And if it's not very diverse, how could you maybe change that? What
Mm-hmm.
could that look like? But you need to also do that as well, right? So where are you connecting with people? I think also helping your kids build like advocacy skills. I think that's an important piece. How do they speak up when something's not right? And I think
Yeah.
practicing that, I think also helping your kids really identify emotions that come up, right? Like, this feels
Yeah.
uncomfortable to talk about, or I don't know what to do, but that it's okay. And how can I find
Mm-hmm.
out? Where can I learn? Knowing that we're going to mess up, pushing against the idea of perfectionism that I think many of us have, that we're supposed to be perfect and that we can't get it wrong. Teaching our
Mm-hmm.
kids that it's okay to mess up and what repairing and restoring that afterwards can look like. That's not a one-time thing and then it's over.
Yeah, I love that. So beautifully said. I think so often, you know, adults, parents feel like we have to have it right, have to know, and being able to say, I don't know, but we can look at this together. We can find out together is such an empowering thing for kids, students to know, and also to know that we're human beings. I often say in my work with communities, there are places where we're going to mess up. I'm going to mess up. I'm not going to get it right. I'm not going to get it perfect, but I'm going to be willing to step in and learn together, learn on my own. And that's
Yeah.
been, from someone who I would say, I used to really strive for perfectionism, as I know, many people do, is like the gold standard, and to realize just what a fallacy that is in so
Yes.
many ways. How I think also that striving for perfectionism creates more disconnection
Mm-hmm.
rather than connection, because it's not something that other people can connect to.
Right.
And
Right.
it's not something that allows for that messiness and that space, and that
Yes.
messiness is where
Yes.
the growth happens. And it
Yes.
took me a long time to realize that, like the beauty of the chaos. And we, in the facilitation and conflict resolution space, we talk a lot about the grown zone, which is kind of a terrible name, but when a community works together, it's almost an hourglass shape. And at the top, for folks listening, that's where the ideas come together and folks come together, and it's an exciting and it's generative. And
Yeah.
then you kind of go through this bottleneck as you get down towards the middle of the hourglass of like, okay, well, here's where the rubber hits the road, and we're, what do we really want to pursue, and what is our vision and goals? And
Yes.
it's tricky and it's chaotic, and it's chaos. It is that chaos, which is also the fertile ground for real change to happen. And then at the
Mm-hmm.
bottom in the hourglass, that's where often it's the struggle, and it's not just a one-time hourglass, it's a
Right.
cyclical hourglass. It's that
Yeah.
relationships that are strengthened and formed during that chaotic
Yes.
time that
Yes.
give like the beauty for that growth to flourish, and for people to say, oh, we have gone through hard times, we know that we can do that. And that, I think, is so core to resilience. And not just resilience though, but flourishing. And it's like we have to be able to feel that. I was in a conversation with someone recently talking about Brene Brown's work and her, her talking about numbing the darkness is also numbing the light, numbing the feelings,
Right.
at both ends of the spectrum. So if we can't go to those hard places with
Right.
people and in
Right.
community, we often can't go to the joy that comes from that shared work together and that shared learning together. And it's both, man, it is so hard sometimes,
Yes.
especially in leaning into learning how to be anti-racist and gosh, I wouldn't even connect the words effective and anti-racist together, but in creating real change, maybe.
Right. Right.
Can you talk a little bit, Rory, about what makes you excited about what's happening in your community? What are you seeing that is bringing you excitement? You've talked about that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think just locally, like I was saying, that these conversations are happening. So,
Mm-hmm.
like an organization putting funding towards bringing in an outside organization to help them to do training for their staff.
Mm-hmm.
Having a group, that show up at a school board meeting to, talk about or push against an issue or push for an issue. That's another one. I think so. There's a lot of different things that are happening, I think, that are exciting, that, and just watching people, even like people like in my group, like hearing some of the things that they are going to be doing in like their community is exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So someone who's leading a book of like a book club specifically around Resma Menacem's book, around healing racialized, around I can't think of the title. Oh, My Grandmother's Hand. So around healing racial harms.
Yeah.
That's not there's a subtitle that I'm getting wrong.
But we'll
But
include
it's
it in the
the
show notes
title's
so
my
folks
grandmother.
can definitely find it. Yes, for sure.
But it's awesome because, right, it goes through, it's very trauma focused. So it's a very
Mm-hmm.
trauma informed book. And so someone just doing that for the white people in their community, which is awesome. And, so people doing different things to be able to start these conversations, helping other people to do it. And to me, that's really exciting to see that done.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
because I look back too, and like, I know I had such a hard time trying to find my place, especially when I was younger in this work, and really felt like nobody understood, nobody got it. And I didn't know where I fit. I had no idea where I fit.
Mm-hmm.
And so seeing it now and seeing like how there's all these different places and it's not just one spot, and it's not like about just getting it wrong or getting it right, and that
Yeah,
what the
totally.
impact can really be.
So what helped you find your spot?
So, a lot.
Yeah.
I think
That's a simple question, but I'm sure a complicated
right.
answer. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I feel like I'm still probably continuing to search of where that place is. I don't feel like it's always necessarily clear.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I was very fortunate in my social work program as an undergrad student to be able to take like an institutional racism class. And that was like one step.
Mm-hmm.
Then continuing my training around continuing to take racial equity trainings throughout my time, continuing to do this work and kind of being brave and putting it out there in different ways. And then sometimes I would try and then I would pull back.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like one thing was just even giving myself permission to be able to do
Mm.
it. Like just deciding that,
So
that
key.
was allowed.
Yeah, that's awesome. That first stepping point of saying we're going to do it. Yeah. So, you've talked about so many things that, clear stepping points, your own journey of learning. Rory, what key lessons learned would you share with others who are trying to create change and are on anti-racism work or the other, work that you've engaged with?
Yeah. I mean, I would say a big thing is make sure you have a supportive community that you're creating. If you don't have it, to create it. I think that's a big piece. This work is not to be done in isolation. It's to be done with others.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very key in this work.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really big piece of it. I think the other part of it is to keep trying, that it's not always right. Like sometimes we may try, and I think people sometimes can get very, and myself, right, can get very discouraged, especially when you're part of a group that's maybe supposed to be working on this, and maybe it's not moving at as fast a pace as you would hope, or or the people above that have more power are pushing against it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of navigating that. And so I think it's don't give up, would be another one.
Yeah, yeah, good words of wisdom there. I think also having that sense of shared not going it alone. I think it's important to be able to
Yes.
speak up, as you said, to create community, whatever that looks like, um, creates power also too,
Yes.
and creates a space where when there are institutions of power pushing against, creates a space for people to be able to work together towards something, and is so key in so many ways.
Yeah. And I think it can also bring up, right, a lot of feelings of some shame or guilt, right? That's a very common one. And so to know that you're not alone in those feelings
Mm-hmm.
and that that's okay. What does that mean? How do we work through it? Like to process, to give yourself space to be able to process your feelings and that your feelings are valid.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit more about that? Finding
Yeah.
space. Yeah. What does that look like? Could that look
Yeah.
like?
So I think a lot of times, right, there's shame around or guilt, right? Like around like, did I mess up? Like all of a sudden I'm seeing things that maybe I didn't see before. So like, should I have done something before and I didn't? So what does that mean now? Or I didn't speak up when I should have spoken up. And how do I now, like, what does that mean for me now? So like, can I go back and fix it? Can I not? What do I do? Like, so there's many factors I think that play into what that looks like. But I think that's a big piece of it.
Yeah, huge. And being able to use that as forward momentum as well
Right.
too. Not, necessarily being stuck in the past, but looking at like, well, where does that go and where can that shift in the future?
Right. And also this, like the feeling of uncertainty, a lot of times of not being sure of like how to do it or what to say or what are the right words, or that people worry too. I think they feel, I don't know enough to have the conversation, right? I don't have the statistics. I don't have enough history. And the big thing that I always like to tell people is the fact that you are where you are right now and you're here and you want to do it, that is enough. That is enough to be able to have the conversation. There's no statistic you're going to be able to throw at someone that's going to change their mind. It's not about statistics, that it's about emotions, connection, the building those relationships. So it's really building your skill set. So it's just the desire to build more skills around doing that.
Totally. And again, coming back to that place of relationship as being the entry point
Yes.
for so much, and creating change based on relationship to relationship rather than an externally imposed framework or system where
Yes.
it often doesn't have a landing point for people.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, I love for so many of us, the arc of our stories shift and change. And, you talked about, your social work background and learning and becoming a partner and a parent. What do you wish someone told you, Rorri, 5 or 10 years ago about this work and work in all its forms?
Yeah. I mean, I wish someone would have told me that it's okay to give myself permission to do this work. I think I didn't think that was okay, that nobody had to give me permission, that I was allowed to give myself permission. I think that's a big one. I didn't have to go looking for it outside. I think the other thing is that I wish I could have had more guidance around, like, maybe here's some people, like look for the people who are doing similar types of things, or those types. And like, I mean, I feel like I have done that throughout the time and reached out to people, but kind of keep reaching for those people who you feel connected to, who are maybe doing something around that or that you feel excited about.
Yeah, I love that. Continuing to reach in different ways. Yeah, connection points. I love that. So tell us anything else that you want to share, Rorri, about any thoughts or reflections you'd like to share. And then I'd love for you to let us know about how people can learn more about your work.
Yeah. So I think really just as a final thought or reflection is that this work is important. Like, we're all needed to do this work and that it's something that we can all be part of. To stay connected, I have a podcast called Racially Responsible, which is awesome. And I would love for people to listen to that. I've interviewed some amazing people where it's really sharing, what does this leadership journey look like for them? What have been their experiences doing anti-racism work? So that's that piece. They can connect with me on my website is U Power Change, the letter U. And those are probably, and my email is, people can always reach out, is Rorri, RORRI @upowerchange.com.
Awesome. We'll include all those links in the show notes so folks can find where to listen, as well as on the episode webpage. So awesome. Well, Rorri, it's been so great to learn about your work and hear, especially how people can engage on different levels, not only from the parenting scale, but the community scale, from an individual scale. And I think some of the takeaways for me are especially just that first step, taking the first step, giving yourself permission, going, welcoming emotions as they show up, as they will.
Yes.
So what a rich and beautiful conversation. So thank you so much for joining the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Yeah.